Hello, I think we are on live now. I want to welcome, of course, Massimo Negri and Jean-Michel. Very many thanks for being with us on. And we are on our last webinar. We have 5 webinars, and this is the 5th. And I think we will close it the best way with 2 big names on the museum studies in Europe, not only in Europe, in the world. So it's really an honor to have you both with us. And of course, the subject of today is the identity and diversity from community to Europe, from local to global, a common heritage. Of course, this is a wide and big issue that with the help of these 2 wonderful guests, we will try to go deep on concepts and also on trends regarding the European museums today. We have some topics that we will introduce on this conversation that I sent it before, like a forward to our guests. Of course, all the audience, I think the most of the audience received a small synopsis of the webinar, but I will try them to just share a bit here. Okay. I don't know if this is already. Okay, I think you are now seeing the topics. Just I'll be fast because it's not me that want to have the conversation with you, but just to guide you. Okay, the first topic we introduced to our guests is this polymorphic character of the contemporary museum, mutation operated on museums world. That passing from a passive and neutral character as a mere instrument of safeguarding heritage and change to a part of the past to a gradually assuming an intervention role as a larger cultural institution. We are not only museums from some time ago, okay? Maybe from the 60s and 70s, of course, these are dates that are not like so, but from long time ago, we are not only museums. So this polymorphic character of the museums is a theme that we would like to explore a bit. So if our guests can make us some notions about this. The second topic is, of course, our headline topic, identity of European museums versus diversity of society. This balance between a common cultural heritage, a European one, versus the multiculturality of European society today. This, I think, is a bit of a hidden conflict as the museums, most of the national museums and the municipality museums that are very linked to the identity of the ground where they are settled, have to face and have to manage. The third topic is the museum's constant challenges. Of course, we have a constant and vibrant change emphasis for museums' role as an active agent inside of the unsafe ground, because it was new for the museums. I'm talking about the economy that enter in the museums management for guaranteeing the sustainability of the museums, has come to be largely dependent on planning and management models supported by self-financing policies. This is maybe an item that Jean-Michel will like to explore, because I know his main frame of his investigation. And finally, the museum's performance. In the first 2 decades of this new century, we had incidents shaping the performance as a cultural institution. I will just quote it some: economic stress, political crisis, cultural transformation, social tensions, climate awareness, migration density, technological acceleration, dematerialization of information, communicational entropy, mass tourism, and nowadays, of course, the dramatic sanitary pandemic problems. All these challenges the museums and all cultural institutions have answered and interact creatively and critically. But I think this is now on the epicenter of all major cultural transformations happening in Europe, and is also an issue. So, and the kind of provocation that I send also to our guests of getting all these topics and following these topics, our European museums are positioned today. What is the position of European museums today on the world and facing their society? It makes sense that maintain a concept as vague as that of a European museum when we live in a multicultural society. Is this still a notion, a concept to be followed? Are museums, despite of their European identity, forced to break further their cultural walls on which their collections are often based instead of reinforce their cultural democratization process, where terms such as inclusion, equality become central in our European society? And finally, what European museums have we today? What kind of museums for Europe? These are some questions, of course, that I want to share with our guests and, of course, with our audience. I will now pass to our first guest, Massimo Negri. I will just present Massimo Negri. I know many people know him because he's a very known investigator in museums and very well known. Massimo Negri is a scientific director of the European Museum Academy. Was also Museum Forum Trust Director from 2000 to 2009 and member of the jury of the Council of Europe Museums Prize and of the European Museum of the Year from 1983 to 2009. Twice Fulbright in Pennsylvania State University and at the Smithsonian Institute Museum Fulbright. Museum consultant and active lecturer, he has developed several museum projects. Massimo Negri was involved on the Museu da Água in Lisbon, so that is one of our big industrial archaeological museums in Portugal, and also written many articles and publications on musical matters. Of course, he has a book that was very relevant on some of these issues that we are talking about now. I hope to pronunciate it well, La Grande Revoluzione del Museo Europeo. I hope I spoke it well, okay? So Massimo, what you can say what light can you bring us with these issues or these topics that I just mentioned?
Thank you very much for the invitation, first of all, especially in the current moment when every occasion to share ideas is, say, more precious than in the past. And perhaps we have understood how privileged we have been so far, having frequent occasions for a vis-a-vis change of idea. I think that this is not something which is totally out of the discussion of today, because as in other sectors of society, the COVID experience will leave a legacy, good or for the good or for the bad. And we've been under pressure a lot in any part of our life, private and social, and we are now experimenting the fact that some of the transformation that we have been forced to do, to carry on, are not only, will remain. The most evident, for instance, in universities, for instance, is that we already knew that a part, at least, of the courses would have been done using the internet, but the COVID forced thousands, would say probably hundreds of thousands of teachers, 1 million of students to move to a new system. And even if we are all looking forward to go back to classrooms, it is true that something will remain, and the way of communicating of schools will remain in the way of communicating of schools. And the same is for museums, and especially, I think, under two aspects. And one is the fact that the digital aspect of the museum collection, well, it came upon to the stage all of a sudden that it is no longer an option, but that the fact of having a substantial digital collection at hand, say, is a plus, a relevant plus. And the second aspect, which in some sense has a lot to do with our discussion today, is the fact that all of a sudden, again, every museum all over the world, let's say all over Europe, even the most isolated, had the chance to be global, in the sense that apart from the linguistic barrier, which is still a relevant aspect, but can be in some sense overtaken thanks to some technological device aspect, the software not so complicated, all of a sudden, even the most isolated museums, it could have access to a global audience. And not only as a side part of its job, but as it was before, say, just a segment, but as a substantial part of what we could call the core business of the museum. I have carried on under the pressure of the emergency last year at the University of Padua, where I teach to a special class since many years. Is an Erasmus Plus, so the students which are postgraduate comes from mainly from outside Europe, and last year we had about 30, 35, I don't remember, students from all over the world, say from Iran to Mexico and from Chile to Cameroon, say. And so I involved them in research about, which is now published and available on our website, the European Museum Academy, about what was exactly their impression, what was their idea of what would become something long-lasting in the museum communication. And of course, there was no ambition, there is no ambition to come to conclusions, but I think that we should keep an eye on the experiences done in this year, probably, unfortunately, in these 2 years, before we come back to normality, whatever this will mean. I think that is something that has to be incorporated in any this public discourse about museums, because it would be not realistic to talk about museum putting in brackets what has happened into these 2 years. But coming back to the starting of the discussion, you mentioned the book of mine, which is called The Great European Museums Revolution, which gives me the chance for outlining, saying in very general terms, in what consisted this revolution, because it is the background on which we have to start any discussion about the next future of museum, in my opinion at least. And 3 are the aspects. One was has been, and it is still, the quantitative aspect. Probably this year, the 2020 and 21, it is will be recorded as the first moment in the recent history of museum, not only Europe, but state to Europe, where we have not witnessed the proliferation of museums for practical reasons. But if you think simply that in the 70s, the Encyclopédie Universalis stated that there were about 17,000 museums in the world. they estimated that, and now only in Europe we estimate there are not less than 50,000. This gives you an idea of what I mean when I'm speaking about a quantitative revolution. Some years ago, the Washington Post stated that they thought that only in the USA, the number of museums exceeded the number of Blockbuster and McDonald's put together. So it gives you an idea of this phenomenon, which has been independent from economic aspect and has a variety of reasons that we don't have the time to examine now, but it's a fact. Continuous proliferation, an endless proliferation, a quantitative growth means inevitably also a qualitative revolution. And the qualitative revolution, for me, to summarize the two main points that could be useful for us today, is first the continuous emerging of new models, of new typologies, and in this context, especially the moving from the collection to the themes. In other terms, museums were defined traditionally by the nature of the collection, and in the last 20, 30 years, it has been the museum as an organization, I would say as a minded organization, an intellectual organization, to define the nature of the museum. This is due to the fact that the approach to the collection is no longer confined to a disciplinary approach, and the same collection can be interpreted with a variety of approaches that makes the inner sense of the message of the museum different according to, say, the vision of the museum. So otherwise we could have witnessed the birth of museums like the Galleries of Justice, of Tourism, of the DASA, the only museum about safety on work, or even museums which seems rather contradictory with the idea itself of the museum. For instance, the Buddenbrook House, the Museum of the Buddenbrook. But the Buddenbrook never existed. It's an invention of fantasy, is a novel. So the museum, which by definition is the place of testifying the reality, because it's based on objects which are certified by the museum as, say, true in some sense. Well, it's in some sense a museum like the Buddenbrook is paradoxical. Or the museum which was opened last year in Washington, D.C., about the world planet, established thanks to the effort of a former elementary school teacher, lady. So the most intangible object, in commas again, the most intangible object, the most important intangible object of human beings, say. So all this, if you want a bit deliberately putting it into chaotic way, but to give you an idea of the variety of aspects which are determined by this thematic, the emerging of thematic more than disciplinary, say, strictly speaking, disciplinary museum, and the variety of thematic. And third, and perhaps the most important from the point of view of the public, the linguistic revolution in the museum, which is basically due to two factors. One is linked to the previous element. So the variety of point of view implies the adoption of different idioms in communicating. Idioms is used here in a metaphorical sense, which means basically way of exhibiting. And the other aspect is the the technological revolution, say the digital revolution mainly, but also in some aspect which could remain apparently not so important, say the lowering prices of devices that were a barrier for a linguistic evolution of the museum, and that then in the last 20 years have become much more affordable for any kind of museum. And for me, this is the aspect that I'm devoting my energies in the last 5 years, basically focusing on the developing exhibition processes, which has been very largely changed say, it has been object of revolution, say. So if we put these three aspects, I hope that this could help to go forward a bit. And as far as, and then tell me when I'm running out of time, because I have the trend of speaking.
We have still 5 minutes or so. Okay?
5 minutes, good, thank you. Okay. So just a footnote about this dilemma, identity, diversity. Well, first of all, museums have been always multicultural, even if it was not in their program, but especially in Europe. It's very rare that you find a collection which is not the result of a multicultural exchange of political aspects. Europe, in this sense, is very different from the United States. Our history is a continuous building up, mounting and dismounting of political geography, at least in certain part of the continent. And almost every collection has some elements coming from outside a certain cultural milieu, a defined cultural milieu. So this is one relevant aspect. So there are historical roots of this phenomenon, and the other is about so multicultural and diversity. The aspect that Europe is by definition a continent rich of diversity. It's not the same as crossing the United States or China or other. I'm using China as a continent, say, not because they are uniform, but simply, for instance, there are some aspects like the linguistic aspect, or in the case of the United States, the architectural aspect. So the richness of, which is also in some sense a burden, if you want, it's something that even for the most, let's put it this way, the museum which is most oriented, nationalistic or chauvinistic oriented, has in itself the seeds for an alternative vision of its collection and its message. It's an intrinsic aspect of the European heritage, and if you want, the European, partially also the European mentality. So I don't know, for instance, if it exists a European culture as such, but what it is sure is that it exists a European heritage, cultural heritage. So I think that we should try to make fruitful use of of the history of our culture and institution, and also in general of culture in individual countries, to put what are the needs of the challenges of the contemporary social scene, making use of what it was, say, perhaps in a different way. I'm closing with an example that came under my eyes some days ago. I'm writing an article about the way of exhibiting African artifacts, sub-Saharan African artifacts in say from the colonial to the post-colonial period. And I read an article, the government of Togo, which is establishing a museum, perhaps the only one, national museum, made a statement saying, we don't want back our objects, as it is, for instance, the philosophy, the policy of many other African countries which are trying to have back from colonial museums, Belgium, for instance, the collections which are brought by explorers, by explorers. We don't want them back. We prefer that you keep them where they are to show them as witnesses of our civilization, because we have the intention to build up our own collections basing on what we are today, which is a part of our history that is not yet told to the rest of the world. It is an interesting attitude which disveils something which is less, if you want, stereotype, less a stereotype like certain approaches to this kind of problems of multiculturalism that sometimes are a bit sterile, in the sense that are done more to silence the consciousness of the curators and of the museum than to have a real impact on society in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Massimo Neri. It was a wonderful appreciation that you made about our issue. Of course, I made some notes. One of the most marvelous notes that Neri told us is museums are always multicultural. This is very important to have this in mind, because when we have all these questions and all these conversations about identity and diversity, of course, the museum is an institution that is multicultural by its nature. So this is one of the things that I retain very carefully. Also, the new typologies that museums are grabbing today, the difference being on the past focus on the collection, and now focus on governance or in management of their museums, and making ways of
interpretation more than yes.
Yes. Also, this term very interesting, that tourism. Okay, the tourism. Now, I don't know if you are getting to the safe museum or something, but of course, the tourism was one of the major things that impacted the museums, and that all the museums have to react and adapt to this big trend that was the tourism. And also, of course, the great example, the African example, that goes a bit against the trend today of the decolonization of collection and everything. This is a great example. I don't know if I agree with you with all this, the crisis that now we're living are getting less museums, less new museums. For instance, in Portugal, they are still growing. They are still growing. That we are now with the 2 new museums in Portugal, big ones. The 2 regarding the Jewish culture, one in Lisbon, the other in Porto. Also, the Serralves is amplifying their museum in 5 million euros. I myself am on a small city. We have 2 new museums coming during this year and the next year, so the phenomenon, I think, continues. I will now pass to our next guest, Jean-Michel. Once again, welcome here, and many thanks to be with us today. I will present you. I think we don't need any presentations, but he's of course an associate professor at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, director of the Option Culture Study and Research Institute, lecturer at École du Louvre in several universities, Lavoisier Fellowship from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a former member of the board of the ITERCOM committee of ICOM, has a doctorate in management, a graduate of the Institut d'études politiques de Paris in public law, and author of several important books. I have here two of them, Musée et Culture, and also Le Nouvel Âge du Musée. That was a book that influenced a lot of museum thinkers and also a lot of professionals, as I myself, I'm included. So I will pass. I know the WM have a presentation ready to go, so I will pass you. Okay, Jean, welcome.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for your invitation, Alberto, and thank you for Professor Negri. Fascinating presentation. So I will try to address now the. I don't know if you can see the slides. Can you? I will try to address one of the topics of this conference, and I would like to see if there is something specific to European museums, particularly as opposed to a possible US type or a category of museums. So we have a particular time at the moment because we are in the middle of the pandemic, or maybe at the end of it. So either we continue the way it was before. I would say we would be back to a sort of business as usual situation, or we take this unique opportunity to redefine what museums can be for the future, and in order to address the needs of maybe particularly communities. So on the short term, there are some pressing issues regarding the economic situation, but on the long run, we can again take maybe some time to reflect on this, on the pre-existing difficulties and issues, and see if we can imagine something different. So, and again, as I said, maybe I will try to put the European model, if there is such one model, in perspective with what how the Americans envision the role of museums. So I think there is something very common to all museums today. There is this global approach. We know that every issue is intertwined between museums. There is one Earth, obviously, and everything is more or less linked. But at the same time, there is more expectations for, well, let's say cultural institutions in general, and museums in particular, to make a difference and to act locally and be relevant to their community and territory as well. What is also common to most of the countries, particularly in Europe and the US, is the changing demographics with the raising issue of ethnicity. We have a very diverse and increasingly diverse society from various point of views, including the geographic origin of the population. And then, as Professor Negri stressed, there is this, or emphasized, there is this issue of digitalization, which can be understood under different aspects. The fact that we as citizens, we expect to be in a position to access the collections of museums. But also we can see new technologies as a way to interact more actively with museums. So regarding museums, I would say that all those changes make more apparent the fact that there are some social issues that are on the table. What the Anglo-Saxons call diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion as a new concept, if you wish. In Europe, we're also influenced by the Declaration of Freiburg on cultural rights, but apart from those new concepts, I think that there are many things that are already included within the public services principles, which can be used as guidelines, or have been used as guidelines by museum professionals. We were talking about the issue of repatriation. We know that whether we like it or not, many countries are demanding the return of some of their artifacts, and we know that so far there are different countries which have started to return some objects, not only France, but also Germany, the Netherlands, and UK. There are some limited initiatives so far, but we don't know the end of the story. So whether we like it or not, we have to reflect on this emerging question. And there's also, I would say, a question of ethics today. We see that there are disputes regarding the role of certain members of board of trustees, particularly in the US. We know that there are some also disputed conversations regarding the role of corporations, those who, like oil companies, for instance, and we also have a conversation regarding the role of branding as a management, as a new management approach for several museums. All these has obviously implications for governance, and we can maybe reflect on that a little bit later. I think that among the questions that exist today, I think that before the pandemic, we were already conscious of the fact that there are some inequalities between museums. There is a handful of very prominent and very famous museums, and museums as well, but then we have other museums that are much less privileged, that have less visitors, less resources, less visibilities. The pandemic reveals also the limits of the existing, or before the crisis, existing business orientation, because we see today, we see that it's difficult to get income from visitors because they are not here, or not that much. Fundraising has also some limits or limitations, and we're not sure whether blockbusters will still be relevant in the future, even if they remain feasible. This also reveals how dependent some institutions were regarding tourism, and particularly international tourism. And we have to face the fact that we're not that successful, both in the US and in Europe, regarding the participation of certain categories of the population, those particularly with lower income and lower education. So if we look at those two situations, we see that in the US there's a real danger of many museums may disappear, which is extremely a very serious situation. We know that some people had to leave museums, and we know that the AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, is talking about loosening the regulation of deaccessioning. which is something quite new. Even if deaccessioning of works did exist, there is a new approach to deaccessioning in order to face the financial crisis of museums. Well, but at the same time, I would say that European museums do suffer, obviously, independent museums or museums governed by associations. But on the whole, there is this assumption that the majority, at least of public museums, will survive and will continue to exist. But at the same time, there is the recognition that maybe as I said previously, the business model of large institutions may have to change in the future. Is digitalization a solution to the issues that were mentioned beforehand? Not necessarily. There are obviously a lot of advantages associated with digitalization, but it will not solve, obviously, all the problems, not from a social point of view, not from an educational point of view, and not from a business point of view. Another limit that I see is the use of collections as sort of financial assets, more or less, the idea of trying to monetize the artwork through traveling exhibitions, through the loan of works of art. I think there's some ethical issues associated with it, and plus we're not sure that it will work in the future. And then management, as you mentioned earlier, management is useful. But it's just a tool. It's not an end in itself. It's just a means. So we need management, but maybe we need not what I would call managerializations, meaning putting too much emphasis on management at the expenses of the very mission of museums. So I think what could possibly guide our reflections regarding the reinvention of museums is the fact that it's very important to reaffirm the very mission of museums, the fact that they have a civic nature that is very, very important, and they do possess some unique values in terms of education, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of citizenship, etc., etc. So maybe more than talking of new management skills, I think it's important that we act as museums with our counterparts, with other local, I would say, institutions, not only arts institutions or cultural institutions, but also institutions from the social field, from the health industry, etc., and tourism, etc. Probably governance will have to evolve in making sure that more people can participate, interact, and contribute to the very life of museums. So my conclusion would suggest that maybe, I'm not sure, we have to discuss this, maybe we have something specific in Europe, which is because the history of museums is partly based on the philosophy of the Enlightenment era and the role that philosophers played at this time. So also something specific and related to this philosophy is the fact that in Europe we see a responsibility of the government, be it the central government or local authorities, we see a responsibility in supporting cultural institutions, including museums. Where in the United States, there is this kind of, obviously the fact that this idea that museums play a civic role, obviously, but there is this the role played by a board of trustees, and trustees are mainly, not entirely, but very often made of affluent people, I would say, with a certain degree of wealth, so which makes it different probably from what we know in Europe. And finally, and then this will be my final words. I wonder if this pandemic and this outbreak just shows that the European model, which has been criticized for being too bureaucratic, for instance, or not dynamic enough, possibly regarding other models, might not prove eventually to be quite resistant, being quite resilient, because, as I said earlier, European museums, for the most part of them, will continue to exist, and they will continue to serve the population and their communities. So it's not my suggestion to suggest that my opinion to suggest that everything's perfect in Europe. I'm just saying that it's okay. I mean, we have to democratize museums more in the future, but on the whole, I think there are some kind of DNA within European museums that make them more or less in a good position to overcome this current outbreak and invent a new model for museums. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. This is a great intervention as we expected. I retain also some things that you say. Mostly, of course, this pressure that and this also the opportunities that new technology implemented in museums can, in one way, abroad the intervention and the perspective of the collections, and of course of the theme of the museum. This is of course one of the great achievements of the new century. Of course, it started before, but it rises very up on the, of course, also with the development of the technology itself. So the museums have been side by side with this increasing. Also, this difference that you made between the European model of museum and, of course, the American model, of the Anglo-Saxonic model. I know because you studied the American museum well on the even in the book, the Museo American, but these also some things that are even polemic in Europe, like of course the decisioning of the collections, okay? Because of course in the moments of crisis, we know this is a very critical thing or polemical. That is that in many ways the American museums have to embrace a crisis. They sell part of their collections. This happens a lot on the contemporary art museums, for instance. I know this goes to the lawns and everything. I don't see this happening in Europe anyway. So, but this, of course, also the rising of the management models on museums. I think the management models have to be balanced with the planning of the museums. Sometimes and you also retain this alert that, of course, as you call it, managerization of that management don't put in danger all the planning of the museum and then the collection and everything. This is still a concern that we have here in Portugal, and of course all the for your intervention, I have the notion that we still have a European model of museum. Okay, we are adapting and all this. You told us some new notion can come after the pandemic, but if I understood well, that we have a European model of museum that as for the Red Cultura 2027 is something that you have to be on notes because can be important on the application. We have also already some reaction. Now we will open to the debate. Of course, but today is a big day for us also. Many of our colleagues in the audience are noticing that. We are reopening our museums from today. Jean is on Paris and Negri is in Milan. They are still closed, the museums. Museums are still closed for a long time. In Italy for 1 year or so. This is also what it focuses also what is happening in museums, because museums have a other life. It's not only the public, open to the public. We have of the background of the museums, and there's a new focus on the background of museums and the background professionals also that came out from this pandemic problem that you have, because the museum have to be closed. It's still working. Okay, so some of the reactions, of course, we have one here from Maria Velasco, that is a Portuguese museum study investigator, well known also. Very thanks to Maria Velasco for their contribution. And she asked you both guests, to refocus on our issue, on our headline issue, that is of course, the duality between the identity and diversity. As it says, I will try to see if I can translate it directly from Portuguese. But the European museums are still very connected to the hegemonic narratives, okay, and still they are not contested, okay. They are still very hegemonic, and they're still using their hegemonic narratives on their in their museums, and their, of course, the communication of their collection, and that now have started to be questionable. That okay. And many people are asking their place in also to have to their other, for instance, in anthropological museums, even in archaeological museums and national museums. This is an issue. Okay, how we balance between the we can change these hegemonic narratives with all the diversity of the society and the multiculturality that we have in society, even when collection of museums are from are a mirror of this multiculturality, but then in the narratives they are not. I think more or less what they say. Of course, our colleague Doris Santos also goes a bit on this issue, saying that still the discourse is very linked to the exotic, okay, the exotic part of the narratives of some collection. I think she's thinking about the more anthropological museums and ethnological museums, and also perspectives, pyramidal perspectives that go from up to the bottom, okay, and not, of course, transversal. I think this is if you can comment on that. Who want to start? Negri, maybe?
I can start, if you want. Well, I stay to the two remarks from the audience with regret, because I would have many comments about our friend Jean-Michel presentation, but there are time limits, so I confine myself to the two remarks.
But you can comment also on the tablet if you wish.
No, I know, but it's a matter of time. By the way, I run the risk to be a bit blasphemy, but my main, the hegemonic discourse is a discourse, but still the main problem for a large part of European museums is that they have no discourse, in the sense that the level of communication is extremely modest. Be frank between us colleagues, say. I don't want that this ideological issues becomes an alibi to ignore the fact that our collections in many places are simply silent, and that's it. So I would be happy to have to struggle against any kind of hegemonic, whatever it means, discourse, because it means that there is a discourse. But the endless series of items in 70, from 70 to 100 pieces in one showcase in an archaeological museum with correspondent captions is not a discourse, and it's not hegemonic. It's simply a noise. That's it. So, sorry, Jean-Michel, just to make alive the discussion. I would be also happy to have the problem to discuss the ethical side of a group of wealthy people so anxious to put money in the museum business, as it happens in the United States, when they consider living, say, in Marquette, just to make an example, in a state college where I spent my study period, and they were anxious to sit in the board, when it's so difficult to have European, at least Italian businessmen anxious to sit in the board of a museum, when they find it rather futile exercise, comparing, for instance, which is obviously more remarkable, put the money in things which are considered more essential to social life, like hospitals or schools or whatever. So this is a bit provocative, but I think it reflects the reality, especially in a continent where we have about 50,000 museums, and 80% of them are small-sized museum, whatever it means. I don't know, 1,000 square meters, less than 10 people in the staff, and huge collection on the other side. And I come and then I stop to the problem of the, which I'm very grateful to Jean-Michel for mentioning the word deaccessioning. Collections run the risk to be a burden in long terms. Be honest, it's a problem. It's a serious problem. It is a problem of sustainability. And my experience is that in many countries, especially in Portugal, Spain, Italy, the level of the storage facilities is appalling, is awful. And so as the pieces in show represent 10–20% for all collections. The rest, I'm very much convinced that what is happening, for instance, in Holland, and what was happening in the UK or in some lender in Germany, to focus more on the exhibition, on the requalification of the storage and opening the storage to the public, which is probably one aspect relevant for the future of a possible European model. And lastly, I want to share with you a feeling, and it is this. Isn't that true that there is not one European country where during the COVID the museums have been perceived as an essential public service? No, I think it was the same in France. Jean-Michel, tell me. It was easy just to close. You can give up to museums, and that has no really influence, apart from the fact that, of course, it's linked to the tourist industry, but not vice versa, that the tourist industry is linked to the museums. This for me is something very worrying. We have done a lot to put on the agenda museums, and I'm not denying that a lot has been done with results, but this the pandemic has been something very radical that have shown in radical terms that there is the risk that we are considered not irrelevant, unless from the patrimonial point of view, which means brings us back to the collection. In this, there are no alibis. We can put together all the elements, the migration, whatever we want, but it remains something which is very basic, and that for me, I'm 73, so looking at the new generation, it remains a strategic issue. I don't think that museum can, and I'm very in favor of what it was said also, but both of you, the fact that museums alone cannot overtake this problem. Museums, and that there is the one you're speaking about, polymorphic, has to do a lot, not only with the variety of collection and discourse, but also on the physical aspect, that our museum, the standard small European museum, has not the facilities simply to be polymorphic, apart from the fact of a way of exhibiting. But so the combination, for instance, and then I swear I stop. For me, it was a great, meaningful aspect that closing down schools and very few cases, the idea of using museum spaces for educational purposes as an alternative to the schoolroom, because it should have been a safer environment. In Italy, somebody started, and the whole thing was totally cancelled, and now we are at the end of the list as in terms of priority.
Before I pass to Tobel, I'm just a comment that I don't know if you are seeing the comments on the forum, no. But in any case, I will, Maria Blaschu, comment something to you, Massimo. Massimo
Yes.
Negri, we are not communicating well, that's true, but museums communication both with what they say and what they don't say, with what they show and what they don't show. They do transmit a position, even if they don't bother giving context for it. People get it. Okay, I will remember, a bit.
I understand the point theoretically, but the museum practice is something different from the theoretical discussion, in my view at least, of course.
There was an old museologist in Portugal that would say that the artifacts and the objects talk by themselves. Okay, the object in themselves talk by themselves, but they don't. They are silent. So you have a problem there. Okay, I will pass to Tobel if you want to comment on the.
Yes, thank you very much, Massimo, for this very rich comments, and thank you to Maria as well. Collections for museum, they are what they are. To me, it's a basis. We had to maintain them for future generations. There's no doubt about that. But we can do almost whatever we want with those existing collections. We can have various narratives probably in the future, in the sense that we have to be relevant, again, whether we like it or not, because it's a question of survival on the long term. We have to be relevant to the various parts of the population, the various constituencies of museums. So obviously, we need more interpretation. We need more education. We cannot take it for granted that people will take advantage of the collections, science collections, history, anthropology, ethnography, art collections. Why? Because less people, well, people, in my view, get more education that they did in the past, but at the same time, I have to recognize that they have maybe less knowledge in terms of history, in terms of religion, in terms of mythology, and we know that many works talk about religion, history, and mythology as well. So we have to start from what people know already, or if we don't, museums are bound to remain more or less elitist, as they are in part. I understand that they accommodate many people, but at the same time, look at the sociological profile of those visitors. Well, they have very much in common in terms of, well, not only economic background, but also education background. So that's what I have in mind when I'm looking at the U.S. model, because I'm not against rich people willing eagerly to contribute to museums. Well, let's take their money. I'm really willing to do that. I'm ready to take as much as they wish in terms of donations of art, in terms of sponsorship, in terms of donation of cash. But at the same time, we have to recognize that those people are not that interested. They're not, or possibly indifferent, I would say, regarding the issue, which is so important to me, regarding the again, I hope this is not a bad word, regarding the sociological profile of visitors. They're not that interested. And how could you expect wealthy people to be that interested in the profile of visitors? So at least in Europe, we have a system where, well, again, this is a very difficult issue, and I have issues with museums in my country myself, in terms of getting access to data regarding the profile of visitors. But more or less, we know that if we use the principles of public service, which has to be universal, it could be a lever to, I wouldn't say force, but encourage museums to be more relevant again to their communities. So as you said, Massimo, yes, it's fair to say that museums have not been recognized as essential institutions in our countries. This is disturbing, because at the same time, at least in France, libraries were successful enough to remain open, not during the first lockdown, but after that, and today as well, they were successful enough in remaining open to the public. So it's very difficult to envision why it was not the case for museums. So I would like to be provocative also, Massimo, and I would say that it's a question, or possibly a question of advocacy. Museums worldwide have been advocating those past years that they were having a great economic impact. And I think this was wrong. This was the wrong approach. I'm not saying that they have no economic impact, but I would say that it's that comes in addition to the rest. Having an economic impact for an institution in our country is not unique. Many organizations do a better job than museums and monuments in terms of economic impact and creating wealth and jobs for the community. But what is unique to museum, what has to be emphasized, and what is, to me, the core of the advocacy policy would be to stress their unique, again, educational, social, and civic role and value. And I think there's a kind of job to be made, in addition to what existing organizations are already doing, in putting the emphasis on what is unique to museums and how they have something unique to bring to the population. Okay, so my fear, I would say, to finish, is that museums might be, in a future, I don't know when, might be seen as elitist institutions. And we already know that there is a kind of decline in public participation for art museums in the US, according to the National Endowment for the Arts surveys. So there is a kind of decline, contrary to what most people think. Yes, there are more people, but maybe the same people coming more often, and plus we have the role of international tourism. So if I'm not completely wrong, there is a risk that a certain fraction of the population would be in a position to say museums are not for us. And if that's the case, they do not deserve our support. And in a democratic society, that means that museums, like opera houses, for instance, or symphonies, they would get less financial support. And they would be, and if that's the case, and maybe I'm wrong, but if that's the case, they will face a difficult situation. I'm sorry, I'm a bit too long. Sorry, Alberto. Oh. Alberto, I don't think we can hear you.
Yes, I forgot to link to the. No, we have still a bit of time, not much, but we want. I want you to hear from you before we end it. Doris Santos agree with Tobalem, so you have one. I'm kidding. I also agree with most of you saying, but I am following this notion that you have for a long, but of course this is a critical moment now that we have to balance. But we wanted to close, and I wanted to still to have also have a question of myself, because you two started to develop or to research a concept that was, I think, you can be would be good to give us some clue. That is museum diplomacy or even culture diplomacy. Can you give us? This is a question because. You are on a European Capital of Cultural Application. Maybe we needed some museum diplomacy and culture diplomacy. If you can give us some clue about this concept before we close this conversation.
If we speak of cultural diplomacy, having a French colleague around the table, it's your field, Jean-Michel, because starting from the moment when in the late 90s the École du Louvre started carry on seminars, short courses in China, and putting your hat, as we say in Italian, on that field, on that area of development. Italy is the opposite of France, is making a very poor use of its cultural resources in terms of cultural diplomacy, while on the other side we had, for instance, during the fascist regime, a large use of the, not museums strictly speaking, but collections in terms of cultural diplomacy. The point is this, and that's to do with the matter of libraries. Now, in Italy, libraries, unfortunately, have been treated at the same level. But there is one point. It is traditionally true, I think, that the libraries, after the 60s, in many European countries, have become a place of aggregation, of social aggregation, beyond the service of just giving you the opportunity to read a book, especially in small places, but also in big towns, at the level of, at the metropolitan level, of district level. This has started, according to my experience as a user, say, in the 60s, when the Anglo-Saxon concept, British especially, of public reading has landed on the continent and really gave a great impulse in Italy, for instance. The establishing of the public reading system can be dated that moment. But but museums are different in the sense that you cannot bring home a book, the experience is limited to the moment of the visit, so basically, apart from all the great potential of the online communication, we don't have the time to discuss that, which is one of the most important issues at the moment. But going back, to put an end to some aspect of the previous discussion, museums offer in Europe a formidable network connected with physical heritage in general. Because if you look at the map, it's kind of, points of preservation, communication, or whatever. It's so precisely disseminated. There is no competition. It's the only network which really covers so systematically the European continent. And this, I think, it's something that, and it is in connection with all the rest, in strict ideally. This is the key point, I think, of a strategy for the next future, to make this more visible, not just because people go to but the role. And it is probably one of the reasons why, going back to the example of the wealthy people, one point is that to sit in a museum board, apart from the fact in many European countries there is not the idea of a museum board, is not a status symbol. Not only in terms of money, but social status symbol. And I think that probably one point to work on more is this, the museum as a crossroad, and should we have a European political culture that we don't have so far, and probably we never have, unfortunately, but this could be a crucial aspect. And then this has a lot to do with cultural diplomacy, which doesn't mean necessarily outside Europe. There is a large margin for an effective cultural diplomacy inside Europe, which has not been exploited enough. But anyway, apart from the aspect of the restitution or, for instance, archaeological missions and so on, the great plus of museum is that museum, in many cases, are learning the techniques of communication of a modern contemporary mass medium. So they can be the plus comparing with the traditional tools of cultural diplomacy, like, for instance, theater, performing arts, for instance, typically music, and so on. Apart from the French, my impression is that this is still very much underestimated and under-experimented. Even for a country, for Italy, which potentially has an extremely rich potential under this respect. It would be worth a webinar about cultural diplomacy. I don't remember, and then I stop, I don't remember in recent times a conference or some occasion, relevant occasion where we had discussed the museums and the role of museum in cultural diplomacy is something that is very much neglected and underestimated. I think it should be worth to go to this subject having the time because it could be very fruitful for all of us.
Okay,
So
Michel.
I would say that maybe if Italy doesn't put too much emphasis on cultural diplomacy, it's because it works by itself. I mean, there's a huge impact of of Italian culture on a global base through
cooking, design, yes, in this sense.
through the art de vivre, through the dolce vita, and through the movie industry, and obviously the art and museums and art cities. But coming back to apart from the Italian case, I think there's a recognition on a sort of universal basis that diplomacy is not the only concern of diplomats and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that many instances in the civil society do play a significant role, including universities, foundations, NGOs, and obviously cultural institutions. We know that in many countries, at least large arts institutions have an international department because they have so many ties worldwide. They have to have someone who is taking care of all these international aspects. Well, that being said, I think there are two major orientations today. Even in France, there is sort of a realpolitik school of diplomacy that contains that you can do both diplomacy and a kind of business, I would say, if you look at the opening of branches or outposts in countries like in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, and so forth, and France gets a lot of lots of money from those projects. And my perception that they are, even though it can be described as a kind of realpolitik, but in the end, I'm not sure that it's so efficient on the long run, I would say. I think that diplomacy basically has to do with values, with exchanges, with cooperation. And in the cultural sector, and museums are here for hospitality. They are here to accommodate as many people as they can from all over the world. So I would say that to me, we have to go back to the basics in terms of cultural diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy, we have to reinforce the role of the transfer of knowledge, expertise, and training in various countries. And I don't think that on the long run, diplomacy is here to protect the existence of states and their influence. But the role of cultural institution is to share values, to exchange values, to exchange forms of art. And that's the only way today we can advance the cause or the role of cultural diplomacy, at least according to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know now we are on we have municipality elections here So I'm sure there will do a lot of museum diplomacy here. I'm sure of it. In any case, just a comment from Doris again. She said maybe the small museums create excellent examples of community aggregation. So maybe it's easier because of their proximity with the community to do that task. She asked, but I think she's also making an affirmation without. Okay, we are closing our webinar. You have Negri, you have a proposition that I think maybe Red Cultura 2027 will think about to make a webinar or a conference about cultural museum or cultural diplomacy or museum diplomacy. I think is a very good item, a very good issue to make a conference or a webinar. The term here, the notion of that is not yet in Portugal well known, so maybe it's a good opportunity for Red Cultura 2027 to make this, this event. We are now close. I will ask you 5 minutes to close the webinar with all you think it would be good for closing this wonderful conversation that we had with you. Okay?
Personally, I'm very interested to follow the development of your application, your project, because of the word "red" in your network, Rete di Musei. I believe very much, but I know how difficult it is to establish a network and to make it running effectively. So it would be a great achievement that a network of museum is the backbone of a project so ambitious. So please keep me updated, and I will be delighted if there are the occasions to go on. Thank you.
Okay, I would just add a few words in saying that it's important to recognize all these various initiatives taking place in Portugal. I think it's important in Portugal and in other countries to recognize the role of the arts and culture, but maybe less based like in the past on arts for art's sake principle, but based on the fact that cultural policy is an essential part of government policies on the whole, due to the connections between the arts and as we said, the social sector, the economic sector, the tourism sector, the health sector, etc., etc. So I think it's very good that Portugal is even more recognized in the future for its wonderful efforts in terms of the arts and culture. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Michel and Massimo Negri, for being with us. It was really a big honor and a big pleasure to have you with us. Also, many thanks to all the audience and the comments on this webinar. Of course, the webinar will be available on the Red Cultura 2027 networks, Facebook and YouTube. You can get the link and share with all the people and friends and reviewing all this and taking notes. We will do it because this is our job for the application effort that we are making. And rest me to say many thanks. The Red Cultura will keep on with these wonderful webinars. I know that in Monday we'll have one on photography, with also with some foreign guests and Portuguese guests also. So see you soon. Be safe, and the museums be open. Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.